I'd like to do today is just kind of go straight to it and talk about a topic that I'm really interested in this month, which is the Lughnasa Games, otherwise known as Ancient Irish Olympics. So, in Irish, the name for the month of August is Lughnasa. Lughnasa was traditionally a month for reaping the harvest, for celebrations, and for competition. The month gets its name from an Irish god who was the champion of the Tuatha De Danann, the family of gods of the Old Irish mythology. And Lu was also known by his full name as Lughnasa Fada Dánach, which means the long-armed master of all arts. As we go on, you'll see that that's an appropriate title, since it was because of him that these ancient Irish games of sports and skill were instituted. A great fire festival also traditionally took place at this time of year, but it is most used as the time for an all-Ireland festival for sports and for games for centuries. The festival predates the Greek Olympics by, they say, at least 1200 years, but legends of early Ireland attribute the games to Lu himself, who was a mythological figure. So there's reason to believe that they may be much older even than 1200 years. It was more than just a sporting event, however. It was a time really to celebrate the harvest. It was a time to celebrate the talents of, the best and brightest of Ireland's youth. And it was also a time for coming together to form contracts or to court a partner for marriage. While the festival is commonly referred to as the Lughnasa Games, it is more accurate to refer to them as the Tailtiu or Tailtiu Games. As I said, legend attributes the founding of these games to Lu, and even though they happen in his month of Lughnasa, they were originally instituted in honor of his foster mother, who was a goddess named Tailtiu. Tailtiu herself is considered to be a goddess of Irish sovereignty, like all female deities. And like most goddesses, she has the characteristics of, a fertile land, a fruitful harvest. So it would make sense that she would also be associated with this time of year as the same as Lu is. Lu loved his foster mother, Tailtiu, so much that upon her death, he decided to institute these funeral games. Initially, they were funeral games. And he said that they should continue every 3 years in honor of Tailtiu. Next, I'd like to read an extract from Lady Gregory's Gods and Fighting Men, where she tells the story of Tailtiu as follows. While Lu was king, his foster mother Tailtiu, daughter of Mamor, the Great Plain, died. And before her death she bade her husband Duach the Dark, he that built the fort of the hostages in Tower, to clear away the wood of Cuan, the way there could be a gathering of the people around her grave. So he called the men of Ireland to cut down the wood with their wide-bladed knives and bill hooks and hatchets, and within a month the whole wood was cut down. And Lu buried her in the plain of Meath, and raised a mound over her that can be seen to this day. And he ordered fires be kindled, and mourning to be made, and games of sports to be held in the summer of every year out of respect to her. And the place they were held got its name from her, that is, Telton, or Telltown. In time, the tradition of the annual games, or some would say every 3 years, it evolved into this big fair called the Telton Fair, or in Irish it would be called An Enoch Telton. In those times, the people of Ireland would travel from all over the island to attend the Enoch Telton. They would come to buy and trade the best of the yearly harvest. Craftsmen would come with their wares, or to simply admire or spy on the work of fellow craftsmen from other parts of the island. Young men would come to court women, and young women would come to be courted. It was considered an auspicious and customary time of the year to make marriage contracts or to enter into contracts for employment and winter accommodation. But despite all of this, the main attraction was the games themselves. Thousands gathered to watch the best of Ireland's young pit their wits and their strength against each other in the hopes of obtaining the glory and reputation, not just for themselves but also for their tribal kin groups to which they were very intimately connected. The games took place very close to the ancient seat of royal power in Ireland, the seat of the High Kings, the Hill of Tara, which is also in County Meath. And to this day, you can still visit the location of Tailtiu under its anglicised name of Telltown. You can look up Telltown in County Meath, and this was the location of the games in the past. The tradition lasted until 1169 AD, when we saw the coming of the Anglo-Normans. And that is the time where we can really say marks the beginning of the end, or the beginning of the erosion of native Irish culture. And it's really important to emphasize those last few words: native Irish culture, what we might refer to as Gaelic culture. In 1916, we had the Irish Revolution. In 1919, we had the War of Independence. This led to Ireland being established as a free state. And what it meant to be the free state was that Irish parliamentarians and the Irish people would have the right to set their own laws and determine the course of our own country. Now, we could spend some time talking about the issues around the Free State and so on. Well, what I really want to focus on here is not the political situation, but the cultural situation at the time. You see, after hundreds of years of British rule in Ireland, it got to a point when British rule was quite cruel and brutal under the period known as the penal laws. There's a reason why Irish people don't speak Irish. There's a reason why Irish people are not familiar with their early customs, the laws and customs of their ancestors. And that's largely due to the policies of Britain while they were ruling Ireland. So it's interesting when we see in the 1920s the efforts of this man, J.J. Walsh, in his attempt to revive the Gaelic aspect of Irish identity, the native Irish aspects of Irish identity. J.J. Walsh was a visionary and a patriot, and he understood that independence didn't mean anything if it did not come with the right of Ireland and of the Irish to possess and express and honour their cultural identity. Just 1 year after the War of Independence had ended in the 1920s, Walsh successfully managed to revive a new form of those ancient Irish Olympics, the Telltown Games. What he wanted to do was draw on the symbolic images of Ireland's distant past. And doing so, show the world that Ireland had an identity that wasn't new and young, even though it had just gotten independence, but in fact it was ancient and rich. Or in the words of Walsh himself, a culture as ancient and glorious as Greece or Rome. So to Walsh, this Enoch, the revival of the Telltown Games, was to be more than just a sporting event. It would be an example of a new nation defining itself to the world, an exercise in confidence building, collective morale boosting, And to Walsh, this would form a fundamental process in the rebuilding and reforming of Irish institutions and the political landscape. The Enoch would be used as a way to show that Ireland was alive and intact despite the hard decades and centuries it had struggled through previously. So Walsh set to work on his idea. He picked a year that coincided with the Paris Olympic Games, and he used this to his advantage because he was able to attract athletes who were in Paris to then attend the Irish Telltown Games following straight after. What we're going to look at now are some images from the opening ceremonies of the Telltown Games, the revived Telltown Games. And as we go through these pictures, I want you to notice how they're dressed. I want you to notice the symbolism. We see Irish warriors, Druid priests and priestesses, and even a representation of the goddess Tailtiu herself, flanked by an Irish wolfhound. This was all to act as a reminder, an ancestral reminder to the Irish, to remind people of the game's antiquity and even the antiquity of the Irish themselves. But like I said, they were much more than just a sporting event. That was a very interesting thing about the Telltown Games. They also awarded things like poetry and art. There were 5,000 contenders in the games, the first ones, and they were competing for 1,000 medals. So in addition to the usual things that you might see at the Olympics, like shooting, swimming, boxing, rowing, athletics, in the Telltown Games, we've seen competitions in chess, in billiards, in yachting, poetry, Irish dancing, and even traditional storytelling. The second Enoch Telltown went ahead in 1928, but it wasn't until the third attempt at holding the Enoch that we really begin to see the clash between cultural identity in Ireland, the clash between the old Gaelic native Irish identity and a Roman Catholic identity, which is also Irish in the sense that it had been around for a very long time. But in this emerging time for Ireland, in this time when Ireland was still figuring out what it would become, we really see this clash of these identities when it came to the third Enoch Telltown in 1932. This was because the Enoch Telltown would coincide with another huge event that was due to happen in Ireland that year, the Eucharistic Congress of the Catholic Church. The Eucharistic Congress sought to promote devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and attracted crowds of over 1 million people. The Enoch Telltown opened 2 days after, and with crowds of only 30,000 people, it was obvious that it paled in comparison to the Eucharistic Congress. Eamon de Valera, who was then leader of the Fianna Fáil government and later president of Ireland, was heavily pro-Catholic. So de Valera seen this as an opportunity to really set in stone that Irish identity would be Catholic, should be Catholic. And he used this opportunity to refuse funding for the Enoch Telltown. Walsh realised that he couldn't rely on government support to host the Telltown Games, and he tried to launch a public campaign. But de Valera preempted this move by establishing a governmental body to assess the proposal to hold another event. And not surprisingly, this Interdepartmental Committee on the Feasibility of Organising the Enoch Telltown reported that it was not viable or fit to continue. And de Valera recommended that it be withdrawn until further notice on the 13th of December 1938. And sadly, we're still waiting for further notice. We can't say that Walsh's efforts were in vain, however. Ultimately, the Enoch was overshadowed by the church, but it did serve a purpose of sort of developing Irish identity in this post-colonial period. Of course, we could all hope that this could have been an even greater legacy for J.J. Walsh, and imagine what these games might look like today if they were to happen. Imagine the spectacle of the opening scene, and imagine this just, celebration of Gaelic culture and heritage and the Gaelic family and the diaspora all over the world, who are united by not actually a modern version of Irishness, which is a state that is, was influenced largely by Catholic faith, but actually a form of Irishness that predates those sorts of institutions altogether. A form of Irishness that has a heritage rooted in mythology and roles of kings and heroes and legends, and distinct from that of other European countries. It's not right to say, really, that the Irish were Celtic. It's more accurate to say they're Gaelic. And this is what has been lost in the formative years of the Free State and later the Republic. That's kind of the long and short of the Enoch Games and the attempts, the Enoch Telltown, the Telltown Games, and the attempt to revive them. I hope you enjoyed this new format of video. If you did, leave a comment. Also, I'd love to hear what you think about the Telltown Games. Would you like to see them revived again today? There's a lot going on right now in the background at the Brehon Law Academy, planning a big facelift and a revamp, so stay tuned for that. Okay guys, thanks. Love to hear your opinions and comments below. Bye. Slán go fóill.